A few years ago, I found myself not quite satisfied with some parts of my life. I was doing lots of things to try and make other people happy, but I wasn't really thinking that much about what made me happy. I thought about the things that had made me happiest in the past, and the thing that I kept coming back to over and over again in my mind was Tuesday night cookouts. I grew up going to Camp Birchwood. It's an all-girls camp in northern Minnesota. At camp, I learned to sail, I learned to do pottery, I learned to sail, I learned to make a campfire and to canoe, and I learned to sail. At Birchwood, you are mostly a boat person or a horse person, but rarely is a person both of those things. It's not common. And I am clearly what one would call a boat person. But each Tuesday night, the kitchen staff would take the night off and every cabin would go to the dining hall and pick up a package of supplies and then go somewhere around camp to have their own cookouts. You might go on a trail, or you might go to the wilderness post, or you might get cold sandwiches and go on a houseboat. But for me, the one time of the week that I did not want to be on a boat was on Tuesday nights for cookout. Every single time I wanted my cabin to be able to go to good rich pasture. It was the place where the horses would go in the evenings and on the weekends to graze, and that was my ideal cookout spot. The pasture was a giant swath of grass in the middle of the northern woods of Minnesota, completely surrounded by trees. Some of the happiest times in my life were hanging out in that field with my friends, grilling hot dogs on sticks, dropping flaming marshmallows in the dirt, and talking and laughing and annoying the nearby grazing horses until the sun went down and the stars began to pop out. My memories of being in that pasture feel like abundant life to me. Now, I know very little about horses and even less about sheep, and so the fact that today is Good Shepherd Sunday comes to me as a disadvantage. The many agrarian metaphors that Jesus uses don't always make a lot of sense to a city dweller like me, and so I take great comfort when the text says, Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. Me too, bro. I'm right there with you. In this passage, Jesus calls himself the gate to the sheepfold, and the next verse after our text, he calls himself the good shepherd. The gate is definitely beneficial to the sheep, and the shepherd is necessary for their protection, but it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what Jesus is getting at here. The one thing that is very clear is that he's drawing a distinct line separating himself from and how he interacts with the sheep from those who have come before him that he calls thieves and bandits, who seem to only come in devious ways to steal, kill, and destroy. But who are these thieves and bandits? It's weird that this is where our passage begins because it's in a much larger story, much longer story that comes before it. Jesus was walking along and he comes across this man who was born blind. There's a conversation that occurs among his disciples about how that happens and asking big questions about sin and the nature of suffering. Jesus shows compassion for the man and assuring his disciples that his suffering was not a result of sin. He rubs mud in the man's eyes and gives him sight. And oh, the hubbub that this causes. Immediately, people are shocked at this miracle and start asking questions of the man. The Pharisees haul him in and then haul his parents in to ask them questions about how this exactly has happened. His parents are afraid because it's already been said that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be thrown out of the synagogue. And so they throw up their hands and say, "Talk to our kid, not us. He's of age." So the Pharisees go back to the newly sighted man again, and he pulls this great little sarcastic move and says, "Why are you guys asking me this again? Did you guys also want to become his disciples?" And they get furious and defensive, and so they drive him away. And Jesus goes and he hears about it, and then he goes and finds the man again. So pause here in our story. All this is, of course, happening in the northern part of Israel at the time of Roman occupation. And while the Roman Empire claimed that when they took over a region, their presence brought wholeness and well-being to the society that was there, that wasn't the on-the-ground experience at all. In the Roman world, 70 to 80% of the population was food insecure, and any rumbles of rebellion were met with an iron fist. So Jesus bringing a message of protection from theft and the image of a green pasture open for grazing by hungry sheep would be a very welcome promise to those who were literally made sick and poor by the empire that they lived under. So maybe this is why he says thieves and bandits. But there were also these groups of Jews who rose up against the empire in ways that did not consider the well-being of the entire flock. There were many divisions of these Jewish zealots at the time of Christ who opposed and resisted Roman rule. One group, the Pecore, was a very violent group whose name is translated from Latin as daggermen. Their goal was to expel the Romans and their collaborators from Judea, ending their domination, and they saw themselves as liberators who would save Israel. One of the ways that they did this was by assassination of their enemies, often in very crowded spaces, where they would just shift back and pretend to be mourners of what had just happened. But they also plundered the property of those Jewish people who had submitted to the Roman authority. The historian Josephus refers to them as bandits of a different sort, who believed that none but God could rule over the Jews. So perhaps when Jesus say that those who came before him are thieves and bandits, it's because he's seeking to distance himself from those who would seek liberation by ways of stealing, killing, and destruction. If we unpause our story, when Jesus is speaking to the once blind, now sighted man, we find that the Pharisees are right there, eavesdropping on their conversation. And it gives a really good argument that it might be them that Jesus is referring to as thieves and bandits. Jesus says, "I came into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." The Pharisees are offended that Jesus might be calling them blind, which they clearly deem as very insulting. And when they cast the blind man out of their presence, before they told him that he had been entirely born in sin. And now Jesus went and gathered that man into his fold and told the Pharisees that though they could see, it's their sin that remained. It's here that he begins speaking of those thieves and bandits who mistreat his flock that he protects and he cares for. Honestly, I think it's really helpful that it's unclear exactly who the thieves and bandits are, because it's always more complicated than being able to point at the person in the mask and say, that's the bad guy. And if we knew exactly who he meant, then we could put this story in a time capsule and leave it where it is and not have to think about who the thieves and bandits are that threaten Jesus' flock today. They look different in different times, so it's helpful for us to be fuzzy on it, because then we can remember that this passage isn't just about then, it's about now too. The good news here, though, is even though the thieves and bandits may change hats from generation to generation, the Good Shepherd is steadfast. While there will always be those who come to kill, steal, and destroy, there will also always be a shepherd there to say, I am the gate, and if you want to get to my flock, you're going to have to go through me first. We have been watching a lot of Harry Potter in my house during this time of being at home, and yesterday my husband revolted. He insisted that a little bit of Star Wars be inserted into the endless loop of the wonders of the Wizarding World, and I'm thankful though, because I was reminded of my favorite and the internet's least favorite scene in The Last Jedi. Finn is piloting his vehicle straight into the path of the massive weapon of the oppressive First Order, ready to sacrifice himself to disable it, yelling, "I won't let them win," when Rose crashes into him, knocking him to safety. And when he demands to know why she did it, she says, "I saved you." dummy. That's how we're going to win. Not by fighting what we hate, but by saving what we love. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus is way more concerned with building up than tearing down. Those who are rejected by the world, Jesus comes to welcome into his fold with open arms. Jesus does not harm, Jesus only heals, and Jesus does not force his own way. He only invites us to follow in his footsteps. Jesus is the good shepherd, even when we do especially bone-headed sheep things like wandering off and getting ourselves all caught up in our own brambles. Jesus doesn't shame us, though. Sometimes the shepherd crook stings a little. Jesus puts us on his shoulders and carries us home every single time. Jesus cares about the well-being of the flock. They know his voice, and he calls each and every one of their names. The 23rd Psalm is so familiar that I bet if I started saying it, many of you could jump right in with what line comes next. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. I learned something new about that passage this week, though. Although he restores my soul is time-honored and meaningful to so many of us, Hebrew professor Robert Alter says it really isn't a great translation. The Hebrew nephesh does not mean soul, but instead means life breath or life. It is the image of someone who has almost stopped breathing and is revived, brought back to life. My life he brings back would be a better translation. Jesus gives a blind man an absolutely resurrected life. And we live in a time where a respiratory disease is literally stealing the breath from people's lungs. But almost every day on the news, I watch people clapping as those who are on ventilators for 15 days were given their lives back. The thieves and bandits may come to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus says that those who enter by him will be saved, will come in and go out and find pasture, that he came that we might have life and have it abundantly. I know there hasn't been much going out or coming in lately, and it might be very hard to identify even what pasture looks like for you right now. But there is an abundance that comes from knowing that God's love for you is so overwhelming that it will overflow the cup every single time. And even in the darkest valley, you are not alone, that Jesus is with you and for you, and that God has prepared a table for you. Maybe it's a cookout after all. A few years ago, one of the ways that Jesus brought me back to life was by bringing cookouts back into my world. I decided that I was no longer willing for abundant life to exist only in my memories, and I started inviting people over. Rarely on Tuesdays, and we never ate in a field, but I had no idea that I would feel the love of God so deeply by sharing hot dogs over a table in the backyard with people that I cared for. It's amazing to me how a meal can do that over and over again, remind us that we belong to one another. A friend asked me yesterday what I wanted to do when life got back to normal. I immediately thought cookouts. The abundant life was never about the hot dogs or the pasture. It was about being with a flock, sharing a meal, and knowing the love of a good shepherd. How has the good shepherd brought you back to life?